Ending Youth Surveillance series. We have a wonderful and amazing guest speaker tonight. We had a really engaging session in October with our kickoff. But my job here tonight is to actually just introduce you so you understand and know who Notice is. And you'll find out a little bit about the No Data About Us with Us fellowship and get to meet the fellows that are participating in this program. But first, I just wanted to share with you that the Notice Coalition, like I said, the No Tech Criminalization Education, is a national network of advocates, researchers, and organizers building a movement to end police surveillance in schools and defend youth justice in the digital age. So we seek to empower Black, Brown, Indigenous, excuse me, disabled and LGBTQIA plus youth and youth from other historically marginalized communities to imagine and build liberated futures. Since 2021, the Notice Coalition has sounded the alarm of the impact of school surveillance, digital pushout, and data criminalization on youth and young adults from marginalized communities. And so we have representatives from the Edgeland Institute. We have the Georgetown Center on Law and Technology.
It was right there.
Right
Privacy
there,
and
right there.
technology.
Oh,
Very
I'm
good.
there too. Look at that.
Yes.
Yes. We have the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance. And I'd also just like for our team to introduce themselves. Ryan, will you introduce yourself as the fellow coordinator?
Hey y'all, I'm Ryan. I'm based in so-called Houston, Texas, Echo Keystone Lands, Caracoa Lands, and I'm the fellowship coordinator. So a lot of you fellows know me, but yeah.
And Sophie, we have our content and curriculum coordinator. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Sophie Wong, she, her pronouns. I am like Marika based in the Twin Cities right now. I have roots in Los Angeles and a lot of organizing background there, and excited to be with y'all in this community. Was there anything else? Twin Cities content curriculum coordinator. I think that was
Go
it.
zines,
Back to
go
you.
zines, and zine artist. And I'd also like to introduce our co-founder. My name is Marika Pfefferkorn. I'm with the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance and co-founder of the Notice Coalition. And I want to pass it over to Clarence to introduce yourself as well, co-founder of the Notice Coalition.
Hey everybody, my name is Clarence, he, him pronouns. I just hang around, Notice, they tolerate me. No. One of the Marika said, one of the co-founders and a part of our leadership team, and based at the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology. I just learned how to get it right myself, just started there a couple months ago. But yeah, super excited to welcome everybody in, especially at this time. We know a lot of us are going to be entering this conversation in a place of frustration and heartache and just trying to process everything that's been happening over the last couple of days. And so I, for one, am glad to have this community in this space, to not lose sight of the work, regardless of what outcome we saw in the election. We knew that we were going to have to continue to fight for the future that young people deserve. And so glad to be here tonight with you all. Couldn't imagine a better place to be. I'll turn it back over to you, Marika.
Thank you so much. And I just want to also introduce our fellows. So we have Tammy, we have Jeremy, we have Jonathan. If you are able, wave on the camera and say hi. The No Data About Us Without Us Fellowship is a 6-month experience, and we have communities in Houston, Chicago, and the Twin Cities where we are focusing on learning about emergent technologies, learning about the organizing that's happening around them, doing work on the ground to identify issues locally, and then to pull together a campaign, action, or work to bring that work locally from their learning in the fellowship. And so we are actually only in the 2nd month of the fellowship. So we are excited to be here in the space with some of our fellows. This is not all of our fellows. So this is a learning space. This is an open space for us to connect the dots and think about all the different ways that emerging technologies are impacting us in education and beyond. And I am going to ask that Clarence introduce our speaker for this evening, and I'm going to pass it over to you, Clarence.
Awesome. Thanks, Marika. So we are excited, elated, and honored to be joined this evening by such a luminary in the field, a thinker, creator. So I have the privilege of introducing Khadija Abdurahman, who is currently the editor-in-chief of Logix, a queer, Black, Asian tech magazine. They have published in outlets like all right, now y'all, I'm about to put my JD to work.
Funambulist?
Funambulist, you got me. Thank you, Khadija. The Funambulist, the Columbia Law and Race Journal, Parapraxis, and ACM Interaction. Khadija's work, Khadijah's research focus is predictive risk modeling within U.S. family policing and tech in the Horn of Africa. Khadija is a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology and has had previous fellowships at the AI Now Institute, as well as UCLA C2I2. So with that, I will turn it over to Khadija.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and I'm really appreciative of this invitation. I actually had made a decision a couple of years ago to stop talking about family policing because in a lot of ways I find it to be very frustrating and traumatizing organizing space. And I struggle with the incentive structure to professionalize advocacy there. And I mean, really coming from a New York context, a lot of what you'll hear people say is this is one of the most organized spaces. What does that mean? It's really hyper-saturated with social workers and attorneys. And it's just, I don't know, it's really the most heart-wrenching thing. I mean, imagine you would be traumatized if the police came and beat you up and, arrested you and threatened you with your life. But now imagine that's happening to your child. That is the deepest kind of harm that you can do to a person, to a family, to a kinship structure, to a community, and that kind of thing. But schools are the largest mandated reporters. And so when I heard that you guys are thinking about surveillance in the context of education and critically engaging tech, I'm like, all right, I gotta, let me brush up. Let me go reread the paper. Let me see if I still agree with some of the stuff that I wrote a couple of years ago. But I'm really honored to speak with y'all. I am gonna give a talk. They asked me to give a real talk, so I'm gonna give a talk. I'm gonna have slides and stuff. But this is a small group, so if there's a point where you're first of all, I speak really fast. I have a heavy New York accent. If you wait, run that back real quick. Feel free to just unmute because I won't be able to see your comments in the chat. And just on the Logix tip, what I wanted to say is that I really invite any of you who might have stories, or if you're working with young people who have stories, to pitch to us. We're not some big mammoth institution that you can't get in touch with us. We're here, we're available. We do only publish twice a year, both in print and in digital. But so what that means is we don't do fresh on the ground reporting that's immediate. But if you have a longer essay that you want to reflect on, any given topic, we really invite that. I'm always happy to walk through with people their pitches, and if you have concerns, you're I want to bounce, I don't know if this is quite it, I'm always happy to give feedback. And we work with everybody who is superstar academics to never wrote nothing except for an Instagram post. And we really invite all different types of expertise. And I'm particularly interested, despite the fact that I am from New York, in hearing stories that are not just from New York and LA, which is where a lot of the critical tech research is always coming out of. And so to have, even though you guys are based in the US, to have perspectives from other parts of the country is actually super critical. And just having nothing to do with the talk, feel free to hit me up, reach out. We also really pay people. I'm not an academic. I always joke that academics don't read. And so the fact that I do, that got me an entree into a lot of these institutions. But what was I saying? Oh, I really believe in payment. So academics don't usually believe in that. And so we pay between 2,000 to 4,000 USD per piece. And whether the person contributing is 15 years old or 75 years old or a refugee or whatever the case may be, we work it out. If you need to send to your cousin, we work that out. So with that, I'm gonna share my screen and go through some slides. I'm gonna give a presentation, but if you have any questions, feel free to be like, Khadija, hold up, can you run that back? And give me 1 second. Okay. Ooh, sharing other things. Now it's, oh, here we go. All right. Can you guys see?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yes? Okay, cool. Predictive risk modeling and family policing. So first I'm going to start off talking about what is family policing and why do we talk about family and not child. So the child welfare system specifically focuses on the child, and they will often use the words of benevolence, saving the child, preventing abuse, things that sound very like moral and, you know, compelling to act, compelling for the state to intrude under the pretense of what is more important than protecting the child. But particularly, and I'm going to overwhelmingly focus on Black families, just because, to be clear, within New York City, we don't talk about racial disproportionality. We talk about almost, it's nearly 100%. There are so few white children in New York City Administration of Children's Services care that when you look at the spreadsheets, when they're disaggregated by race in the columns for white, they will usually place an asterisk because the numbers are so low that in order that if they did reveal that information, it would be de-anonymizing the data set. So overwhelmingly in my talk and in my work, I focus on Black families. Nationally speaking, you know, Black people are disproportionately represented pretty much across the board, and in certain places, including in the Midwest, indigenous people and or Indian tribal, depending on like the census categories that are used in every jurisdiction. But it was Black mothers in particular that really focused on this idea of family policing, because when you exceptionalize just one member of the family and try to assess or articulate their vulnerability to whether it's abuse or to state intrusion in opposition, having a set of interests in opposition to the family and the kinship network is basically an okey doke that allows the entire family to be ripped apart. And so that's why we are continuously emphasizing family policing. It's not in the same way that say like the Christian right or something talks about parental rights. It's not about the child as property. It's really about expansive notions of what constitutes kinship, what constitutes families, particularly when we're thinking about the plantation or within welfare. Many of the parents that we see being targeted for investigation and for the harshest forms of outcomes, including removal, are mothers who have had previous child welfare experience as a child, but also people who are having non-monogamous relationships. You know, the stereotype of the welfare queen and the baby mama is this idea that this like sexual promiscuity is endangering the child. And so when we're talking about family policing, again, it's not a defense of the child as property or of the nuclear family, but it's to say that there's no such thing as a child like in isolation, in the abstraction. They belong to, you know, ancestors, to a larger kinship generational network. And when we're looking at the systematic of removal of children from their family, transferring them to other communities, this is a violation of Article 2E of the Genocide Convention, and it constitutes genocide. And one of the people, I actually don't have their last name, we published them in issue 20. Their name is Matthew, and I'm remembering them because they're a Black person who was adopted, actually twins, who were adopted into a sundown town in Wisconsin by white evangelical Christians. They're an amazing, amazing writer who relocated to Minneapolis specifically because he wanted to connect with the adoptee community. And he published a piece like using Black studies and like thinking through this experience in issue 20. And I'll drop the link after this. But one of the things he always brings up is that interracial, transracial adoption is also transnational adoption, because when you have to think about African Americans as a nation. And so what does it mean when you bring these children and you transfer them into these white homes? You're not just separating them from their biological connection, you're also separating them from their nation, from their culture, from their community, in the same way that we think about you know, children from Guatemala or Kenya or Ethiopia being adopted internationally. The last thing I want to say on this is that, you know, the conditions of family policing, they're very horrifying, they're very traumatizing. And at the same time, as somebody who came from a lot of movement work, I'm really anti building out a movement that's based on the worst day in someone's life. I'm not interested in that. Like, I am always thinking about one of the strategies that I was not successful in implementing, but I was really trying to push the space. I actually just moved back to America. I was living in Ethiopia for the last 2 years, and I was organizing right up until I left. And one of the things I was pushing was for people, like when you're often, when somebody has made a report or a call against you, and when the people won't come and snatch up your kid. And I was pushing people for, before the child gets removed, bring the family to the church, in the same way that we think about ICE sanctuaries. It's not, I mean, I actually, is probably obvious from my name, I didn't like grow up Christian. This is not like so much of a religious argument, but just in the same way that we think about ICE, immigration sanctuaries, things like that. And then the community can come together to support that parent if there are any interpersonal challenges there. But the other thing
Thank
that I
you
really,
very much.
oh, sorry, go ahead. Do you want to say
Just to
something?
let you know, I'm on a Zoom call, so I'm not going to be talkative.
Okay. What was I just saying is that, oh, the thing that I really want to emphasize, like, even though you might hear me talk about some horrifying things, is that a huge percentage of adoptions fail. And many of those kids actually leave the foster care system and reunite with their biological family, whether it's their mother, their parents, the aunties, the uncles, including Matthew, who I just mentioned, who's now living in Minneapolis. They reunited with their family. And so, severance isn't the end of the story. And so despite all of these systems, while I also don't want to just celebrate resilience emptily, like it's not the end of the story. That's what I wanted to say. So that's mostly what I'm going to say on family policing. There'll just be one other component that I'll add. But what is predictive risk modeling? And I think it's really important here. I try to go to naming like what actually constitutes it, because when people are thinking about surveillance, so much of surveillance studies is overdetermined by sightedness. And so we talk about the Foucauldian panopticon, right? Where you have that like central pillar in the middle of the prison. You can't tell whether the guard is watching you or not. Or you have the logo of the surveillance camera. And so what does surveillance mean within a system in which we're not talking about cameras? When we say that support is not surveillance, that family police are surveilling you, what does it actually consist of? And so some of the ways that I think about that is, first, data and infrastructure. Two, rhetoric. And somebody that has heavily influenced me on that tip is Andre Brock, who wrote the book Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures, and is talking about reading social media infrastructure as text. What kind of stories is it telling about you, to you? What does the user interaction foreclose or allow? And then the third component that I will just bring up is like the relationship between digital interventions and the actual policing. And this is a point that I raised because I either see like on the police abolitionist side, to the degree tech is talked about, it's like, okay, policing, originates with slave patrols that are happening, anywhere between slavery to abolition to, post-Civil War period. And therefore, like, surveillance is not actually solving the problem with the police and is fundamentally anti-Black. All of those things are true. But I do think it's actually important to look at how the adoption of things like predictive risk modeling or automated decision-making systems actually transform the way policing is conducted. And I will circle back to that, actually referencing something from algorithmic ecology, which is when I was doing another project called We Be Imagining, I had spoken to Sophie about, because they were involved in that project. But the first thing that I wanted to say is on the data and infrastructures part. And so, a lot of people will talk about data now through analogy. Data is like oil. Data is like big tobacco. And I'm like, it actually is not like oil or big tobacco. And why are we always talking about this through metaphor, through analogy? And so data is the production of an archive. And the way that it's telling a story. And the structural way that it's telling a story is very akin to like colonial administration. And so, when we talk about the academy being colonial and we say something about like anthropology, it's not just a set of attitudes or biases or predispositions that discriminate against, the objects or the subjects of inquiry. It's actually that the types and the ways that the data is collected are linked to how to administrate a population in service of empire. And so whether it's the Medicaid clinic or it's the District of Family and Child Services or whatever it's called, and wherever you might be currently living or located, it is not neutral the way people are quantified and codified, categorized, classified, and moved through space. It is always connected to administration, and specifically sorting and classifying people through space. And the other part of this here is what I wrote, Accounting for Slavery, which is a little bit of a nod to a book by that name, where it's talking about basically slave masters remotely controlling populations on the plantation through accounting books and through the ledger. And also another person to mention is Simone Brown, whose work was very influential in my own thinking, and I'm sure for many of you, who wrote the book Dark Matters. And in there, she's talking about the Book of Negroes, where there was a ledger recording like Black people and enslaved Black people as they were exiting the slave ship, and classifying them, based off of phenotype, based on their attitudes, and then like creating a valuation of literally how much they should cost and should be sold for, but also what kind of like safety and behavioral challenges they might present with on the plantation. And so when we're talking about data collection and surveillance, these are like, to me, very important components of understanding and articulating like what is the data, what is the surveillance. And in terms of like the relationship to actual policing, even though like foster parents or caseworkers or police officers are not like my primary concern in terms of a political empathy, it is important to understand when we're talking about automated decision systems, we're often talking about labor management tools, and we're talking about the racial and class tensions within the police themselves. And so there's an idea, like, for example, within the New York City Administration of Children's Services, I'm not sure about like where each of you are located. The majority of frontline caseworkers are usually first generation or like recent immigrants from the Caribbean, and somewhat West Africa. And so you actually have, they're almost all ran by white people. And in particular, most of these agencies in New York started off being organized around religion. And so there was a Jewish board for family and children's services. There was a Protestant, there was a Catholic Charities, because they would only take kids that were whites, but also that belonged to their certain denomination. And there's an idea that like, basically these frontline caseworkers, whether we're talking about, traditional policing or within these family and children's services, are polluting the data sets and contaminating it because they are uneducated. And so they, like, for example, in ACS, they had them, they procured iPads, which then were also GPS locating the worker and seeing if they were taking the most efficient route to between each home, between each office, how much time they were spending on each case, and trying to, micromanage everything that they were doing. And even though the police officer is not necessarily like the protagonist that we care within our political empathy, it is important to know that this is one of the transformations that is being introduced, is to try to shift power away from frontline human decision making to not a machine that is like autonomously making decisions, but to a technocratic class that is working in cooperation with the leadership of these family policing agencies. And then the last component that I want to share on that note is interagency data sharing. And so the thing that we see in the 1990s is that there's tens and tens and tens of thousands of families that are being separated from their children every single year. And that's just like in New York City alone. And what we see moving into like the early to mid 2000s is that the rate of removal is dropping, and it no longer is removal the modal case for a family policing encounter, which is similar to what we see in like misdemeanor encounters with the police. And so this is not to minimize the severity and the trauma that comes along with having your children removed or being separated from your family. This is just to say that like, what else is happening then? And so with that, what else is happening? It is a combination of interagency data sharing and something called prevention services. And what that means is that a much broader swath of people are now interacting with the police, and the hope is to eventually get to a place where they can preempt the traditional mechanisms, like somebody making a report and making an accusation that, you're a bad parent, you don't have food in the fridge. So to feeding it in preemptively with data such as from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, birth certificates, flagging any birth certificate that only has one parent listed on the registry and saying like, you know, this is now a risk factor, looking at behavioral health usage among people who have Medicaid. You know, do you have a mental illness is not actually a question about the state of your mental health. It's about, are you accessing behavioral health through a Medicaid clinic? Whether you have food insecurity, it's not about how much, they don't know how much food you have in their fridge. What they're looking at is, what is are you on food stamps? For how long? How many people are on that case? And so the through line is, number one, merging all of these interagency data sets to expand policing, to preempt any kind of call complaint as the mechanism for intrusion by the state. And this is I wonder, you might have already seen this from algorithmic ecology. And this is an image that comes out of a partnership between Free Radical and Stop LAPD Spying. I'm a huge fan of this work. And, you know, maybe the significance is not immediately apparent, but basically they were looking at Predpol, which is a particular proprietary predictive policing model. And the like dominant framework for understanding this is that the assumption is that Predpol would be targeting people inside of Skid Row, which is like an encampment of unhoused people within a specific part of LA. But what they found was that a lot of where Predpol was labeling and categorizing people as high risk and having a higher rate of police encounters was actually on the perimeter of Skid Row. And I'm bringing this up to say, because like most parents, when I'm talking to them about like surveillance and data sharing, they're like, what the hell does this have to do with me? They're taking my kid and you want me to worry about them taking my data? This seems like a very immaterial concern. But what this algorithmic ecology really effectively visualizes in my mind is how these are actually digital forms of containment, creating what Virginia Eubanks would call like a digital poorhouse, preempting all kinds of like political solidarity building, ways of coming together, even if you can't actually visualize it. As people are trying to exit Skid Row, that's when they're encountering arrest. I do have a lot of slides that I'm going to skip, but I will just share that this one came out of, I used to give, you know, computer science is a very depressing field. And so when I wrote this paper, Calculating the Souls of Black Folks, I got so many engineers who were coming excited to hear, like, how do you calculate Black people's souls? And so I created this trigger warning. You actually can't predict Black people's souls. There's a few things here that I just want to share. One, this comes from the Office of Children and Family Services, and this is how they categorize people by race. So one of the things that I've tried to push back on is this idea of Black and brown, because like, what exactly do you mean Black? What exactly do you mean brown? Are we talking, because the situation, like, so for example, you see here with Latino, it doesn't actually, for the most part, there's only one category that's like a /Black. And /white, but for the most part, it is this kind of like liminal category that doesn't actually define. It's like conflating ethnicity with race. And in the category African American, what you'll notice is that there's two particular countries that are named. They don't actually explain this in the like citations for this diagram, but my speculation is that Ethiopia and Haiti, there were both two big waves in New York of international adoption that ended up in dissolution. And so then you had this disproportional representation among people of this ethnicity within this racial category. And I guess the only other thing to point out here, again, like Asian, when we're talking about brown, I mean, we're really not talking about, say, like Brahmin or upper caste Indians. They're specifically locating East Asians. Although interestingly, in the state of New York, there's very few Asian people represented, which I'm only highlighting because there's a common phrase that like, neglect is just poverty. And so the primary classification for a family police investigation is neglect. And people are saying that you just are criminalizing poverty. But actually on per capita basis, Asian families in New York City have a higher rate of poverty per capita than African Americans. However, they have disproportionate family policing in the opposite direction, in that they are almost completely unrepresented within the system. And the reason that I suspect for that is because Asian Americans within New York City have higher rates of Medicaid and food stamp enrollment, but not in cash assistance and shelter placement, where there's the highest rates of removal and intrusive forms of surveillance. How are we doing on time?
We have about 25 per minutes, and that would include questioning. So
Okay, so I'll just end on my last couple of things. I have some things I can just talk about when we discuss about my own positionality to this. I would just say that, like, a lot of parents, when I'm saying, like, what do you know about predictive analytics or predictive risk modeling, they think this. They think a whole bunch of equations, some shit that's hard to understand. They don't know what I'm talking about. But in reality, a lot of times we're talking about this. We're talking about eugenics. We're talking about telling a story through data collection that justifies classifying, sorting, and containing people away from social life. And this slide came up because I was looking for a red herring, but I actually learned the first time I gave this talk that red herrings are not actually red. But the red herring is disproportionality, disparities, and bias. This is like a common watchword of all work in this area, but I don't think it's really helpful. Because, like, imagine if you were saying, like, Black people are disproportionately murdered. Okay, now if you start, murdering white people at a higher rate, there would be less disproportionality. Is that like a desirable goal? Does that actually like liberate anyone in this situation? I don't think so. Let me see. I'll just share one last thing. Oh, this is my abolition starter pack / bingo. And so these are things that I look for in organizations that tell me what time it is about them. And so, like, rushing away from abolition to talk about reimagining, loves to talk to you about everything except the FOIA request you submitted, or this is public records request. They love DEI. They're often BlackRock investment vehicles. So specifically thinking about the Annie E. Casey Foundation. They love advisory boards, collecting data about foster kids. They love to, like, have rainbow flag removal. And so specifically the discourse around Black and to some degree Latino or Hispanic, depending on where it is, families, is that they are homophobic. And so there needs to be a preemptive removal of children to protect them from the homophobic families of color versus white people who are inherently progressive, something that we also see with the pink washing of Israel. Anything else I want to say? More on the same here. Okay, I think I can stop to take questions now. I'll just close this.
I want you to feel those look like some good slides passing by there. If you are open to it, I would love for you to present for another 5-10 minutes if you have it, and then we can open questions at like 6:20, or we can just open questions. It's up to you where you are in your.
Sure, I can share a few more things if that's useful.
Because this is really rich information. And just a reminder that we want our audience that is not with us presently, but as we'll share the recording out, we'll be able to benefit from all these stories as well. So thank you. Please proceed. Please proceed.
Okay, great. I do have a lot of slides, so I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'll try to highlight a couple. One is that, so like the dominant framework, which I reject in my work, is fact or FAT. And so just to give you a sense of the like libidinal economy of computer science, the two main computer science conferences were called FAT Star and NIPS, and they both had to change their name because FAT, they kept making fun of fat people, and NIPS, they kept making fun of people's nipples. So then it became FACT with 2 C's, and NORIPS, which I can't even remember what NORIPS stands for, but FACT stands for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. So this was a key framework that was happening, to be fair, in a context where people were very techno-solutionist, meaning thinking that, the way to solve social ills is through the introduction of technology as a political solution in and of itself, and yet that political solution as a mode of technology is not politicized. And fairness, accountability, transparency questions ask things like, an Allegheny family screening tool here, just for context, was the pilot model for predictive risk modeling in the family policing situation. Allegheny County is in Pennsylvania.
Pardon me really quickly. Yeah. Can you share your slides again?
Oh, can you not see the slides? I'm reading my slide.
No,
I'm thinking that you can see it.
We hear you, but we don't see it. Thank you.
All right. So that makes a lot of sense. So I'm like, why? What you mean that you can't see it? All right, it's coming. Okay. Can you see now? Okay, sorry about that. You were missing stuff in there. The Allegheny Family Screening Tool was the pilot model, and it was also kind of brought to critical attention more broadly through Virginia Eubanks's book called Automating Inequality: How High-Tech Tools Police, Profile, and Punish the Poor. And so questions that come out of the FACT framework would be like, is the Allegheny Family Screening Tool fair? Is it accurate? Is it transparent? Is it accountable? And I put in brackets 2 question mark, because even when we're talking about accountability, when you're in these spaces that don't name their like theory of change or like how they're conceptualizing things and the way that we think about the Young Lords or the Black Panthers or the Civil Rights Movement, you know, it's not just to loud or celebrate any of these as like not having their own problems, but I'm just saying they're marked politically in a way that questions about technology are not. And that's important to understand. I'm gonna skip around a little bit. I bring this up in the context. So what's interesting about prevention services is that the vast majority of prevention services are what they call behavioral health, mental health, therapy. And it's not that I'm against us thinking about like interiority, you know, how do we feel inside, about trauma, about affect. What we really see with the introduction of like trauma-informed models and like trauma addressing services within carceral systems is that it opens up people to even more intrusive forms of policing, of intimate forms of violence, because now you have to be available, you have to be on red in the context of what is ostensibly an interrogation by any other name. And this image is a real advertisement for the antipsychotic drug Haldol that comes out in 1974. And I myself, like the way that I found this image was in the book by Jonathan Metzl called Protest Psychosis. On one hand, I have to say, since I made the slide, the book is so important and I got so much out of it. And what's featured in this advertisement is basically you have someone that's a play on James Brown. And they took the Black Power fist and they turned it the other way and said that assaultive and belligerent, psychotic, you know, let's give him Haldol. On the other hand, sadly, Jonathan Metzl is like apparently a diehard Zionist, which I didn't know at the time when I had created the slide. But the book is important, and I think like this says so much about the family policing encounter, because what is a more normal reaction to somebody saying, I'm going to break up your family, than to be upset and to make a political argument, and now they have like psychopathologized it. Oh, and this is something that I love to show. So Stuyvesant High School is one of the most competitive specialized high schools in New York City, and maybe nationally. And the reason why I bring it up is because, you know, family police, they'll say like, we're here to, you know, improve communities, improve families. We're here to help people get them ahead. But like, you know, similar to Stuyvesant High School, Black people wouldn't even be allowed in if the services were really that beneficial. We'd have to demand affirmative action. People line up around the block, spend thousands of dollars to get their kids into the best possible experience. If family policing was actually beneficial, we would be having to advocate for us to get access to it instead of the other way around, which is that, you know, we're forced to take it at the barrel of a gun. This is just something I always laugh about because, you know, we have this fear of kids being left home alone, but it was also a blockbuster movie, and it's funny because it's a white child. And so there's so many ways that like race structures our interaction with the concept of a child left home alone. And this is also an ad from ACS about like, you know, be a part of a team that protects children and support families, become a child protective specialist. And I juxtapose this was a Black Families Matter protest. This is my colleague in the center with the yellow shirt named Joyce McMillan, who had her kids snatched up about 25, 30 years ago, eventually got them back and became a family advocate. Let's see, anything else I want to share in here? The only other thing that I think is really important to know when we're talking about family regulation systems or family policing is that a lot of people associate it with the first line here, which is Child Protective Services. These are the people that are conducting investigations when a report is made against a family. But family regulation is actually much more vast than that. They run jails and detention centers. Unlike most of the world, you know, kids can be incarcerated as young as 8 and 9 in the US. They often run childcares through voucher systems and also daycare. They run residential facilities or congregate care facilities. They also operate the foster care system, but often are contracting out through nonprofits, and the state doesn't directly run them. Quote unquote preventive services, which I have touched on briefly, and also drug treatment, substance use facilities. And there's actually even more facets, but it's something that's much more vast than just the act of investigation following a report. This is an image here of, this is the Brownsville, Brooklyn Youth Detention Center, where teenagers are held. This is the one in the Bronx, which actually keeps kids as young as 9. And this is an image. November is actually adoption month. And this is an ad, like a real ad from the New York State Office of Child and Family Services. And they basically advertise children. You know, it's like, Chris enjoys Chinese food and learning about cars. Would you like to open your heart and home to Chris? And like the other thing is, like, if you click on a link that's associated with this, there's usually a dollar amount. So when we're talking about the relationship to slavery, the relationship to the auction block, we usually mean like quite literally. And I think these were posters that I helped design that we put up all around New York City. And part of the point there was all this outcry about children being separated at the border. And it was like, they separate children at the border of Harlem too. And so there is this way that like everyone else except for Black people is recognized as a nation and as a community that deserves to have self-determination and autonomy. And that's often something that we're trying to push back on in the context of organizing. They were very mad. We got a billboard. Let me see, is there anything else I want to, and I think that actually truly is it now for my slides. So I know that was kind of an anticlimactic ending, but I invite all of you, if you have questions, and I mean, it doesn't have to be me like delivering knowledge. We can have a dialogue.
So I want to invite people to both use the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and share your questions. I'm excited to hear what folks have for you. So is there anyone that wants to kick it off?
And I saw somebody ask for my email, so I'm just putting it there. If any of you want to reach out to me, or if there's people that you're working with, feel free to reach out to me. And I see one person raising their hand if you want to unmute.
Dr. Adams, come on up.
First off, thank you so much for your contributions to this space. This was absolutely excellent. And Marika knows I spent a lot of my time talking about AI and broader stakeholder engagement in corporate spaces. So it's nice to be able to understand some other things that help inform my work. But I didn't have a question. I really just wanted to tell you that I'm just grateful for your space, grateful for your leadership, and this was quite excellent, and I learned so much today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's nice to know that some of this is resonating.
All right, let's see what we got.
Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. I so enjoyed that. You're on top of it, and we at the Honey Brown Hope Foundation, really, we're looking forward to collaborating with you.
Oh yeah, please reach out to me. We really are interested in building an intergenerational organization that, like, you know, structurally includes you from like decision making to publication. So would love to learn more about your work.
We are working with a family in Montgomery County, which is one of the most, I would say, racial counties in Texas, in reference to a family that children were taken from them by CPS and adopted. They were adopted out to a white family, and they are continuing to monitor them and harass them with their other children. And it doesn't appear that the children who have been adopted, the twins, are really being taken care of. And this is something that we really need help with, but I'm going to share it, pitch the story to you. so that more people will be aware of what is going on. But thank you. Very informative.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm always down to support. You know, like the thing about stop and frisk, right, is that the cops are stopping you outside. The injustice is happening in front of everybody. But when they come inside your house, number one, there's no witnesses. Number two, being accused of child abuse is kind of like being accused with rape. Like, even if you didn't really do it, people are like, well, maybe they did. What does the allegation mean? And so you know, what I have seen over the course of my lifetime is just so many people keeping this to themselves and feeling such tremendous shame. But I think what is the like counter side of the data is it also shows that no, like what's actually happening is systematic targeting of specific communities to try to decimate them. And it has nothing to do, it's not like in every community there's abuse, in every community there's trauma. We're not seeing the children of Japanese survivors of internment camps having their kids snatched up. We're not seeing the children of Holocaust survivors having their kids snatched up. It's very specific, you know, communities that are being threatened with separation and subjected to surveillance.
And what our community as a people, we don't understand when exes report to CPS, how that is really impacting your child and what can happen to your child. And that's in this case, it was an ex that called CPS, the reason that this happened. And they don't do a thorough investigation. It is sad to see how our people are being, I would say, put into this without the proper knowledge of knowing the systemic repercussion of calling a CPS for a revenge case. It's not about the child's welfare. It's about being revengeful and making sure that you're the one as the ex get control of the children, get possession of the children, but many times that don't happen.
No, absolutely. And so, you know, I had mentioned just like on an aside, one of the highest rates of removal are among families that are in the shelter system. But even within that, the highest rate of removal is among mothers who go to the domestic violence shelter.
Yes.
And so even advocating for themselves, trying to get away from intimate partner violence, they're often subjected to the highest rates of removal. And like their own report and their own trying to fleeing the situation is often weaponized against them. And so, and the only other thing I would add is, so like ACE scores, you know, adverse childhood experiences, that like original Kaiser Permanente study was actually a majority white, middle-class, college educated people in major urban centers. This is not, and so many of those people were reporting like, you know, what are the questions that are on the ACE score? Like, have you, you know, heard your parents arguing? Do they have incarceration? Do they have mental illness, substance use problem, right? And so they found that there was a very high ACE scores among these white middle-class people. This is not who is being targeted by family policing. I'm not saying this to be like we should revengefully go after them. What I'm saying is there's no correlation between interpersonal harm and frequency and intrusion of state surveillance or removal. Those things just are not correlated. So it's not like, you know, there are parents that are harmful. You know, there's all different kinds of circumstances. It's not to romanticize the situation, but that's just not the indication or like the pretense under which the police are getting involved. And they know that, like, for example, NX calling is like a very common after a sequela of a breakup. They, you know, they will investigate every single time, even if somebody is saying, you know, you have nuclear weapons in your house. Like, they know there's no way that you have nuclear weapons in your house. But every time somebody makes that call, they will say, we are mandated to investigate, and often strip search the whole family.
Yes.
So I want to invite others to think about a question. Feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm going to pass it in just a second, but I too have a question.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we often, particularly from our fellows, are like, we're doing deep dives into thinking about thinking critically around tech. But one of the things they also want to understand the landscape of is what are the solutions people are working on? Who are the folks that are addressing this, and what is the work that is happening to counter what's going on right now?
Yeah, I would say, like, you know, in order to come up with solutions, you have to start by accurately identifying the problem. And we have a system where, you know, because first of all of the shame that is associated with it, and because of the level of political racial marginalization among those who are the primary targets, that people barely understand the child protective service component, which is like, you know, again, the investigation, removal, and placement aspect. And that is about 5% of this huge system. And like, you know, they, in many cities including New York, like ACS has almost a comparable, if not at some points excess budget compared to the NYPD. So we're talking about a lot of power. They're running the domestic violence shelters, they're running the daycare. You cannot get away. So I think when it comes to like suggesting solutions, like I could talk about, you know, there's a history of Black women like maternity circles that are doing like doula and midwife work, like informally, like historically from like the post-Civil War period to the present, right? There are all these ways that people do continually resist. But I think in terms of like formulating a solution, tech often structures this very like knee-jerk thing, like how will you fix this? How will you understand this is a question of like scarcity, efficiency, and optimization? And I think the first step is to step back and be like, hold on, let's actually scope this out. What is all involved now? Would be my short answer.
That is a great answer. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I believe it's Katya.
Yeah, thank you. This is Katya. Sorry I joined late. But I really, really loved your talk. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us. It's truly, really informative and exhilarating also. But yeah, my question is, I have I think from where I sit, like this might be more particular to my experience, but I have spent a lot of time in like tech for good spaces. And so what you said about like engineers, like kind of moving around with like this attitude like everything tech is neutral or positive basically is like extremely harmful. And I think also in my experience it's added like a second layer of harm. It's like the original harm that's happening through the policing, and then the second layer of harm being like the whitewashing or like the ignoring of the way that tech is reinforcing that or like hard coding it. My question for you was like, how do you speak to those people who are like moving around as if this is just like, oh, well, that's what the index says, so that's what we have to do, or like that's what that's what the scores say, so that's how we have to respond. Like you kind of already alluded to pointing out a couple of like the discrepancies, but I'm wondering if like, how do you deal with it when you meet people that are just like, wanting to just like be in their bubble of like, I just work on the tech, I'm not doing anything wrong. Or like you mentioned, frontline workers also who are like kind of feeding into the system too, in a way.
I mean, I don't know how helpful this answer, but it is, but like mostly I don't. There was like a very brief period kind of around the time that I was writing this where I was never messing with the caseworkers. I mean, as somebody who personally has trauma in our system, that was never even a possibility. And then also I just have like an aversion to a lot of movement spaces because accountability turned into this almost like professionalized therapeutic thing, which also freaked me out. And I was like, all of y'all get away from me. In terms of the engineers, I used to critique them and I would critique the like fact people. And I just got to a certain point where I was like, number one, it's like the white men in industry, and then it's like their wives doing the criticism. And I was like, I'll be talking to people, and then I realized, like, oh, you a trust fund baby. Oh, your father is the senator that made this policy. And I'm like, why am I in this conversation? And so I say that all to say that, like there's an African American proverb, what type of time these people on? I'm not on that same type of time. And so my thing is with Logics and with another project that I did previously, We Be Imagining, I'm trying to just basically circumvent all of those people. I'm not really even interested in criticizing them. I am interested in how can I invite my biggest barrier is so many people that is on the same type of time as me. They hear algorithms and they think they failed math class, you know, like they're like, I don't know nothing about that. People are really convinced that like Mark Zuckerberg, some white dude in his father garage, is the type of people who could talk about tech. And I'm like, no, there's like maybe a little learning curve, but I could get you there. You don't need no math required. You don't need to go learn Python. I know the coding camps got you feeling like you have to learn how to do C++. That's not what's needed here. And that's where I show the picture of the calipers and eugenics, because, you know, people start connecting the dots. People know what's up. In all of your communities, you know, and I know academics use this in a way that is like meaningless, but I mean, you know, whether it's your racial, ethnic, your zip code, your professional world, you know, people are connecting dots. All of us have limitations. We don't see the whole bigger picture, but you have some sense of the power dynamics you had to, or you wouldn't have been here. And the only other thing I'll say about engineers, like I had this conversation recently with somebody who works at Google, and they were very anti-ICE, right? But then they had learned like through a series of events, and they work specifically. I knew them just because my ass is disabled, and I was talking to them about disability, and they work in the accessibility department. And they learned like through some actions that were happening at Google that actually the features that they were working on were being used by ICE and in different contracts with immigration policing and drone bombing and things like that, because the strategy that these tech companies have gone with is to fragment and fracture so much of the workflow that the immediate politics of the situation are not legible to the engineer or whatever the case may be. And so there's some people that are, you know, they're like, I'm getting fuck you money. They're paying me $750. I could put my whole family on. I'm not going to ask no questions. But there's a lot of people who are seeing like, I'm working on this thing that's allowing deaf IDF soldiers to, you know, more surgically bomb people in Gaza. You know, like they're able to put that together. And it's those people, there's somewhat of an opening, but I would still say you can't have it on their terms. They're not on your time. So, you know, like they have to, it's good you want to be woke, but you got to go all the way. You know, you got to come over here and be able to defer.
Wow, I needed that. Thank you.
No, these are great questions. Thank you.
I know we're technically at time, but I do just have like question comment about so one of the things I have like struggled with is really like what you just did masterfully, like exposing the eugenic logics behind so many of these technical systems and the social systems as well. And I guess I've been very interested in like the way that people use like art or other like cultural means of being able to like communicate and expose that in these systems, and showing that they're not new, they're not innovative, they're rooted in a particular historical context, and they're like really replicating that work. I'm curious if you have insights, comments, thoughts just about like how do you make that very bare kind of laying out the intellectual ideological like history of genealogy of a particular like technology, whether it is predictive analytics, whether it's whatever. How do you make that, how do you expose that, center it, and like get people mobilized around that?
I think a lot of it is remembering what you've been new. I think, you know, a huge portion of what an education is like forgetting everything that your mama, your family, your wherever you came from, what they taught you, how to communicate it. And so, you know, and I'm also thinking because my partner has been in university and comes from Ethiopia. And so we're from the southern region of Ethiopia called Oromia, which is like Ethiopia, a very long story, but like Ethiopia is an empire, there's an indigenous majority, there was a history of enslavement, so some parallel to the US context, right? And so we're always talking about, they're like a PhD student now, and they're trying to talk to their mother, who doesn't also speak English, about what they're studying in the university, and like, they don't know what the hell they're talking about, even though they're talking about Oromo things, right? And so many times, even if you literally speak English and you're doing work in English and that's your mother tongue, I just mean that like, you're taught that your forms of knowledge are not valid, and not just like as a self-esteem representation question, but like your entire way of approaching the issue is constantly rejected and excluded. And so you knew how to have these conversations from early on, and so it's like recognizing those points of deferment to where you transform to meet the needs of the institution, to meet the needs of the funder. But I feel like if you reflect on it, you know, people who are making quilts, braiding hair, African fractals, right? Ron English, if you want to look that up, talks a lot about like algebraic uncertainty and Black hair braiding patterns. You know, if you were making tostadas, pupusas, I don't know, like all of these things are like indigenous knowledge making that I'm sure most of you or all of you have in your, you know, earliest part of your life.
Thank you. Khadija, I wanna respect everybody's time. And if you do need to leave, please feel free. But I'm wondering if you have time for one more question from
Sure,
Christy.
I can do it.
Come on, Christiana.
Hi. Okay. I just had a question. I am in high school
Mm-hmm.
and I like, how do you get people that kind of are interested, but like Loki don't want to spend that much time understanding it? Like, how do you communicate it in a way that is is it worth having that conversation if they're not really interested? Is it something where you should meet somebody where they're at? Is it something where you should pursue it, or is it something where you have to wait for them to come to you?
I would say, like, going back to a little bit what I said the last time, I do think like the academy, the university education has a way of telling us that to learn something, you must suffer. It must be very dry. It must be very boring. Like, I am always interested, whether it's my work with Logic Magazine or when I've done events, you know, you don't have to convince people that a concert is good for them. You don't need to convince somebody that, yo, these oxtails and rice and peas taste good. No, they're with it because they're intrinsically motivated, right? And so if we're always doing things that are like for the good, for the betterment or whatever, and people are running away, I think there's like some fundamental questions to ask here. Because yes, the common like way that this is narrated is that everyone has a short attention span or whatever, but you know, people who are spending hours listening to their favorite musician, meeting up with their family, rolling a blunt, playing double dutch, I don't know, all types of things. Like, people are not so unable and unwilling to really sit and be a part of something. But why are we always doing something that we ourselves are not even interested in?
Oh, okay. So then, like, communicating it in a way that's very like accessible, like the same way that you were doing it just now, making it like a conversation rather than a lesson.
Yeah, but I would say it's not just like another method to get our agenda completed. It is also about like maybe me not even talking about something relevant. You know, if I'm lecturing, if somebody is telling me, why are you talking to me about data, they're taking my kid, I have to also really pause there and be like, why am I talking about this? Is this really relevant to what's going on right now? So it's not, yes, accessible, yes, let's make things fun, but it's not just like ways to make the medicine go down. It's also like, am I myself being attuned to what is really being asked of me right now?
Okay, that was actually really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Clarence, do you want to close us out?
No, nothing other than to say, join me in like let's giving Khadija a round of applause for such an amazing presentation and for sharing so much of our time with us tonight. We really appreciate you. And just to everybody else, be on the lookout for the next installment of our youth surveillance, ending youth surveillance series. These have all been absolutely phenomenal, and we're going to keep building on that in the next few weeks. So be on the lookout for that information. Otherwise, everybody, hope y'all have a good night, and we'll see y'all next time.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
To everyone.